Come on, man. Let's roll for fun. Marcus looked up from the mop he'd been running across the academy's mat space, the fluorescent lights overhead casting harsh shadows across Ethan's grinning face. The black belt stood there with his arms crossed, GI crisp and white, the worn fabric around his lapels telling the story of years spent on these mats. Behind him, a cluster of students had stopped their drilling to watch, their expressions ranging from amused anticipation to uncomfortable awareness that something cruel was unfolding. Marcus tightened his grip on the mop handle. He'd been working at this academy for 8 months now, arriving every evening at 6 to clean the mats, wipe down the mirrors, empty the trash bins, and disappear before the last class ended. The students rarely looked at him. The instructors nodded politely but never asked his name. He was furniture to them, part of the background, invisible labor that kept their training space pristine. He preferred it that way. Anonymity was safer than recognition. Silence was easier than explanation. But now Ethan had decided to make him visible. "I'm working," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady and low. He was 42 years old, lean in a way that suggested functional strength rather than aesthetic muscle, his shoulders broad beneath the gray custodial uniform he wore. His hands were scarred across the knuckles, old injuries that had healed wrong years ago when he couldn't afford proper medical care. "You can work later." Ethan's smile widened. "I've seen you watching us sometimes. You curious about jiu-jitsu? I'll teach you some basics. No charge." The other students laughed. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the kind of nervous social laughter that occurs when someone with status makes a joke at someone else's expense and the group feels compelled to participate. Marcus recognized it. He'd heard it before in different contexts, different rooms, different lives. "I appreciate the offer, but I need to finish this section before the next class," Marcus said. He dipped the mop back into the bucket, wringing it out with deliberate slowness, buying himself time to assess the situation. Ethan wasn't going to let this go. Marcus could see it in his posture, the way he'd positioned himself to block Marcus's path back to the storage closet, the way his friends had unconsciously formed a semicircle that transformed this interaction into a performance. "It'll take 5 minutes." Ethan stepped closer, and Marcus caught the scent of the expensive acai energy drink he'd been sipping between rolls. "Unless you're scared? That it? You scared to roll with a black belt?" Marcus set the mop against the wall. He could feel every eye in the room on him now. The academy had grown quiet except for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic outside. He thought about walking away, about claiming a bad back or a policy against fraternizing with members, but Ethan had engineered this moment too carefully. Walking away would be interpreted as cowardice, and cowardice would make the next 8 months unbearable. These people would treat him with even more contempt than they already did. "All right," Marcus said, 5 minutes. Ethan's grin transformed into something sharper, more predatory. "That's what I'm talking about. Come on, man, let's have some fun." Marcus pulled off his work boots and set them beside the wall. He walked onto the mat in his socks, the canvas slightly damp from where he'd just mopped. Ethan was already moving to the center, slapping hands with his training partners, performing for his audience. Marcus took his time, rolling his shoulders once, twice, feeling the old familiar weight of anticipation settle into his chest. He hadn't grappled in 11 years, not since the injury, not since everything had collapsed. The students formed a loose circle around them. Marcus counted maybe 20 people watching, some still in their GIs from the previous class, others in the no-gi gear they wore for the mixed training sessions. He recognized a few faces, the young woman with the purple belt who always arrived early and drilled takedowns with mechanical precision, the heavyweight brown belt who moved with surprising fluidity for his size, the teenage kid with braces who'd just earned his blue belt last month and wore it with obvious pride. None of them knew what they were about to see. Ethan approached with his hands extended for the slap and bump that traditionally started a roll. Marcus met his hands, felt the aggressive squeeze Ethan gave, the little dominance play that preceded the actual grappling. Then they separated, and Ethan dropped into his fighting stance. He came forward fast. This was the technique of a confident black belt, someone who'd spent years developing his game and knew exactly how he wanted to impose it on his opponents. Ethan shot for a collar tie, trying to control Marcus's head and set up his preferred off-balancing sequences. His left hand snapped out toward Marcus's neck, with practiced speed. Marcus's hand intercepted Ethan's wrist mid-motion. The grip was precise, thumb positioned perfectly on the radial nerve cluster, fingers wrapping to control the ulna. Marcus's hand placement wasn't the desperate grab of an untrained person trying to prevent being controlled. It was technical, exact, the kind of grip that came from understanding how the human wrist functioned as a mechanical system of small bones and connective tissue. When Marcus applied pressure, Ethan's entire arm structure collapsed inward, the neurological feedback forcing his elbow to bend and his shoulder to rotate forward. Ethan tried to pull away, confusion flickering across his face. Marcus didn't let him. Instead, he stepped his right foot forward, his hip shifting in a subtle rotation that positioned his center of gravity directly beneath Ethan's extended arm. Then he sat back. The throw happened so smoothly that several students would later swear Marcus had simply guided Ethan to the ground rather than actually throwing him. But those who understood grappling recognized the technique immediately. It was a variation of sumigeishi, the corner reversal, executed with the kind of timing that made it look effortless. Marcus had used Ethan's forward momentum against him, his grip on the wrist serving as the anchor point, while his hips and legs did the actual work of the throw. Ethan rotated through the air and landed hard on his back, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a sharp exhalation. Marcus didn't pause. He followed Ethan to the ground, his body already moving into the position he needed, before Ethan fully understood what had happened. The transition was fluid, each movement connected to the next in a sequence that eliminated empty space and wasted motion. Marcus's right leg hooked over Ethan's hip, while his left leg slid under Ethan's far leg, establishing the seatbelt grip that defined back control. His right arm threaded under Ethan's right armpit and over his shoulder, his left arm doing the mirror opposite, his hands connecting in the configuration that gave him complete control of Ethan's upper body. Ethan bucked, trying to shake Marcus off. The attempt was instinctive, the reaction of someone who suddenly found themselves in a bad position and wanted out immediately. But Marcus's weight distribution was perfect. His hips were heavy and low, his chest pressed against Ethan's back, his hooks preventing Ethan from using his legs to generate the explosive power needed to escape back control. When Ethan tried to peel away Marcus's top arm, Marcus simply adjusted his grip, sliding his forearm deeper across Ethan's throat. The rear naked choke was the most fundamental submission in jiu-jitsu, taught to white belts in their first month of training. But fundamental didn't mean simple. The difference between a rear naked choke that could be defended and one that finished the fight immediately came down to angles, pressure points, and precise application of force. Marcus's choke was perfect. His choking arm was positioned with the radial bone of his forearm directly across Ethan's carotid artery, not pressing against the windpipe, but cutting off blood flow to the brain. His other hand reinforced the position behind Ethan's head, creating a frame that Ethan couldn't break. The angle of Marcus's body prevented Ethan from tucking his chin effectively. The pressure was immediate and overwhelming. Ethan tapped, 3 rapid pats against Marcus's arm, the universal signal of submission. Marcus released immediately, rolling away and standing up in a single smooth motion. Ethan stayed on the ground for a moment, one hand touching his neck, his face flushed with exertion and something darker, embarrassment. The kind that came from being utterly dominated in front of peers by someone you'd assumed was inferior. The gym was silent. Not the anticipatory silence from before, but the stunned silence of people processing something unexpected. The purple belt woman's mouth hung slightly open. The brown belt had stopped mid-stretch, his hands frozen in place. The teenage kid was staring at Marcus like he'd just watched someone pull a rabbit from a hat. Marcus walked back to his starting position, his breathing barely elevated. He'd been on Ethan's back for maybe 8 seconds total. The entire sequence from the wrist control to the submission had taken less than 15 seconds. Ethan got to his feet, adjusting his GI with sharp, jerky movements. The flush on his face had deepened. He looked at Marcus, then at his friends, then back at Marcus. "Lucky shot," he said. His voice was too loud, compensating for something. "You got me off guard. Let's go again." Marcus considered refusing. He'd done what was necessary to preserve his dignity. Continuing would only escalate the situation, and escalation led to questions, and questions led to conversations Marcus didn't want to have. but Ethan was already moving back to the center of the mat, already gesturing for Marcus to follow, already re-establishing the performance for his audience. 5 minutes is up, Marcus said. Come on, man, one more, for real this time. Ethan's smile had vanished entirely. I wasn't ready, you know I wasn't ready. The other students were watching this exchange with increased interest. The brown belt had moved closer, his eyes sharp with the kind of analytical attention that serious grapplers brought to technique. The purple belt woman had her phone out now, not filming yet, but holding it ready. The head coach, Professor Silva, had emerged from his office, drawn by the unusual silence. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, observing. Marcus could refuse. He could pick up his mop and return to work and let Ethan preserve whatever narrative he needed to tell himself about what had just happened. But Professor Silva was watching now, and Silva ran this academy, and Silva had the power to terminate Marcus's employment if he felt Marcus was causing problems or disrupting the training environment. One more, Marcus agreed. They met in the center again. This time Ethan didn't perform the friendly slap and bump. He came forward immediately, shooting for a double-leg takedown, his hands reaching for the backs of Marcus's knees while his head pressed against Marcus's hip. It was aggressive, technical, the kind of takedown attempt that worked against most opponents because it was fast and committed and leveraged the mechanical advantage of controlling someone's legs. Marcus sprawled, his hips shot backward while his chest pressed down onto Ethan's shoulders, his weight dropping like a guillotine blade to flatten Ethan against the mat. Marcus's forearms slid under Ethan's armpits, his hands locking behind Ethan's head in a front headlock grip that gave him complete control of Ethan's cervical spine. When Ethan tried to drive forward, Marcus's superior position prevented any forward momentum. When Ethan tried to pull out, Marcus's grip controlled his head and made retreat impossible. Marcus walked his feet around, circling toward Ethan's side while maintaining the front headlock. The movement forced Ethan to turn with him or risk having his neck cranked at a dangerous angle. As Marcus completed the circle, he released one arm from the headlock and reached across Ethan's back, his hand gripping Ethan's far hip. Then he lifted. The lateral drop was a judo technique that translated beautifully to no GI grappling. Marcus used his front headlock control as the primary gripping point, while his hand on Ethan's hip provided the leverage to elevate and rotate. Ethan came off the ground, his body horizontal for a brief moment, before Marcus drove him back down to the mat, with Marcus's weight falling on top of him. The landing put Marcus directly inside control, one of the most dominant positions in grappling. Ethan tried to shrimp immediately, his hips escaping toward the space Marcus had left. But Marcus had left no space. His weight was distributed perfectly, his shoulder pressure driving into Ethan's diaphragm and making it difficult to breathe, his near side arm controlling Ethan's far arm, his far side arm controlling Ethan's near hip. When Ethan attempted to bridge, Marcus rode the movement effortlessly, his base too wide and too heavy to be unseated. When Ethan tried to frame against Marcus's face, Marcus simply transitioned to mount. The mount transition was textbook. Marcus's knee slid across Ethan's stomach, while his other leg stepped over Ethan's head, his weight settling onto Ethan's chest with his knees pinching Ethan's sides. Ethan bucked harder now, the mounting panic of someone who recognized how badly this was going, but couldn't figure out how to stop it. Marcus stayed heavy, his posture upright, his hands controlling Ethan's wrists and preventing any effective defense. Then Marcus transitioned to the armbar. He fell back, his legs swinging over Ethan's face while his hands isolated Ethan's right arm, pulling it straight and hugging it tight to his chest. Marcus's hips lifted, applying pressure to the elbow joint, the hyperextension threatening to damage ligaments and tendons. Ethan had less than a second to decide whether to tap or risk serious injury. He tapped, harder this time, slapping the mat repeatedly. Marcus released and stood up again. He hadn't said a word during the entire exchange. 45 seconds had elapsed from the initial takedown attempt to the submission. 45 seconds of perfect technical execution. Every movement economical and precise. No wasted energy, no hesitation, no mistakes. The silence in the gym had transformed into something else. Whispers began circulating through the watching students. The brown belt was saying something to the purple belt woman, gesturing with his hands to illustrate a detail of what they had just witnessed. The teenage kid had turned to his training partner, his voice rising with excitement. Professor Silva pushed off from the doorway and walked onto the mat, his expression unreadable. Ethan remained on the ground longer this time. When he finally stood, his GI was disheveled, his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, his breathing labored. He stared at Marcus with a mixture of emotions that cycled too quickly to name. Then he did something unexpected. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. The words came out quiet, almost too quiet to hear. "I was being a dick. I shouldn't have called you out like that." Marcus nodded once, accepting the apology without adding anything to it. Professor Silva stopped a few feet away from both of them. He was in his mid-50s, a second-degree black belt who'd trained in Brazil under the Gracies before immigrating to the United States 30 years ago. His eyes were sharp with the kind of intelligence that came from spending decades reading bodies and movement. He looked at Marcus for a long moment, then spoke. "Where did you train?" Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the physiological response to a question that opened doors he'd deliberately sealed. Long time ago, different life. "That wasn't white belt movement," Silva said. His tone was careful, not accusatory but deeply curious. "That wasn't even blue belt or purple belt movement. Who gave you your rank?" "I competed," Marcus said. The words felt heavy, each one carrying the weight of everything he wasn't saying. "Before, I competed for a few years." Silva's expression shifted. Recognition flickered in his eyes, the look of someone connecting pieces of information that had previously seemed unrelated. "What name did you compete under?" Marcus hesitated. This was the moment, the decision point. He could give a false name, maintain the wall between his current life and his past life, preserve the anonymity that had protected him for 11 years. Or he could tell the truth and deal with whatever consequences that truth brought. "Marcus Washington," he said. The brown belt made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a laugh. The purple belt woman's phone came up immediately, her fingers flying across the screen as she searched the name. Professor Silva's eyes widened fractionally, the only outward sign of his internal reaction. "The Marcus Washington?" Silva's voice had changed, taking on a tone of genuine respect mixed with disbelief. "Pan Ams, Abu Dhabi, Mundials, that Marcus Washington." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. The purple belt woman had found whatever she was looking for on her phone, and she was showing it to the people around her, the screen displaying footage from competitions that felt like they'd happened in someone else's life. Young Marcus, 28 years old, competing at the IBJJF World Championship, submitting a Brazilian black belt who'd been favored to take gold. Marcus at the Abu Dhabi Combat Club trials, winning his weight. Division with a perfect tournament run. Marcus receiving his black belt from Master Cavalcanti, one of the legendary figures in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the ceremony captured on grainy video that had circulated through the community for years. "Holy shit," the brown belt said. "Holy actual shit. You're Marcus Washington. You were supposed to be the next big American competitor. Everyone said you were going to win Mundials at black belt. Then you just disappeared." The questions would come now. Marcus knew this pattern. The curiosity about why he'd stopped competing, where he'd been, what had happened to derail what everyone had assumed would be a legendary career. He could feel the questions forming in the air around him, pressing in from all sides, demanding answers he didn't want to give. "I got injured," Marcus said. The simplification was necessary. "Couldn't compete anymore. Had to find different work." "But you're moving fine now," the teenage kid said, his voice bright with the naive optimism of youth. "You could come back. You could start training again. That was incredible what you just did." Silva held up a hand, silencing the kid. He was still looking at Marcus with that analytical expression, reading things in Marcus's posture and word choice that the students couldn't see. "We would be honored to have you train here," Silva said. "Free membership, lifetime, no questions asked. And if you're interested, I could use an assistant instructor. The intermediate classes need someone with high-level competition experience." The offer hung in the air. It was generous, more generous than Marcus had any right to expect. Free training at a high-level academy would cost thousands of dollars annually if he were paying. An instructor position would provide additional income, maybe enough to quit one of his other part-time jobs. It represented a path back to the world he'd left behind, a chance to reclaim part of the identity he'd been forced to abandon. It also represented exposure, visibility. The end of the quiet, anonymous existence he'd built over the past decade. "I appreciate that," Marcus said carefully. "Let me think about it." Silva nodded, understanding somehow that pushing harder would be counterproductive. "Take your time. The offer stands." He turned to address the gathered students. "Back to training. Open mat continues. What you just saw was world-class jiu-jitsu. Study it, learn from it, but give the man his space." The students dispersed slowly, reluctantly, still casting glances back at Marcus as they returned to their drilling. Ethan lingered for a moment longer. "Seriously, man, I'm sorry. If I'd known—" "You didn't know," Marcus interrupted. "It's fine." Ethan nodded and walked away, his shoulders hunched in a way that suggested he'd be replaying this evening in his mind for weeks. Marcus retrieved his boots and put them back on, the mundane action grounding him back in the present moment. He picked up the mop from where he'd left it against the wall. Professor Silva hadn't moved. "You're going to keep cleaning?" "It's my job," Marcus said. "I meant what I said. The instructor position. You'd be helping people, teaching them what you know. That knowledge shouldn't be wasted pushing a mop." Marcus squeezed excess water from the mop head, watching the dirty liquid drip back into the bucket. "Knowledge doesn't go to waste when you keep it to yourself. Sometimes it just waits for the right moment to matter again." Silva studied him for a few more seconds, then nodded and walked away. The academy gradually returned to its normal rhythms, students drilling and rolling, the sounds of bodies hitting mats and labored breathing filling the space. But things had changed. Marcus could feel it in the glances that flickered his direction, in the way people now made room when he moved between sections with his cleaning equipment, in the whispered conversations that stopped when he came within earshot. He finished mopping the main mat area, then moved to the smaller training room where the kids' classes were held. The work was meditative when he allowed it to be, the repetitive motions creating space for his mind to settle. But tonight his thoughts kept circling back to the rolls with Ethan, to the sensation of his hands finding grips that his body remembered, even though his conscious mind had tried to forget them, to the way it had felt to move with that old precision again. 11 years. That's how long it had been since the injury that ended his competitive career. A torn ACL during a tournament in São Paulo, the knee hyperextending during a particularly aggressive leg lock attempt by an opponent who'd been losing badly and had decided to take a risk that violated the unspoken agreements about how hard to go. The ACL tear had been bad enough, but the real damage had been to the meniscus and the articular cartilage, injuries that required surgery Marcus couldn't afford, and recovery time he couldn't take because he'd been living in Brazil on a shoestring budget, surviving on sponsorship money that disappeared the moment he could no longer compete. He'd flown home to the United States with a knee that would never be the same, no health insurance, no savings, and no backup plan for what to do with his life if he wasn't a professional jiu-jitsu competitor. The years that followed had been difficult in ways he didn't like to remember. Dead-end jobs that paid rent, but nothing more. Physical therapy he'd managed on his own through YouTube videos, and stolen advice from sympathetic trainers at the cheap gym where he'd worked the front desk. Slowly rebuilding his knee's stability until he could walk without a limp, then jog, then eventually move in the ways his body had been trained to move, even if he could never push it to the same extremes again. He'd stayed away from jiu-jitsu academies during those years. The temptation to train would have been too strong, and training would have meant confronting everything he'd lost. It was easier to find work that had nothing to do with martial arts, easier to pretend that chapter of his life had closed permanently. When he'd finally taken this custodial position 8 months ago, it had been purely for the overnight differential pay they offered, not because he wanted to be around the sport again. But tonight had broken something open. Marcus emptied the trash bins in the changing rooms, wiped down the bathroom sinks, and restocked the paper towels. The last class of the evening ended at 9:30. And by 10 o'clock, the building was empty except for him and Professor Silva, who was doing paperwork in his office. Marcus stored his cleaning equipment in the supply closet, signed out in the logbook by the front desk, and headed for the exit. "Marcus?" Silva had emerged from his office, still holding a stack of papers. "Have a good night, and think about what I said." "I will," Marcus said. He stepped out into the parking lot. The November air was cold, carrying the promise of winter. Marcus's car was parked under one of the broken streetlights in the far corner, an aging Honda Civic with a mismatched door panel and 200,000 miles on the odometer. He unlocked it, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there without starting the engine. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline after effects, probably. The physiological residue of the confrontation with Ethan, the sudden explosion of movement after months of careful stillness. He gripped the steering wheel until the shaking subsided, then started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. The drive home took 20 minutes through mostly empty streets. Marcus lived in a studio apartment in one of the older neighborhoods, the kind of place that rented month to month and didn't ask too many questions about your employment history. His furniture consisted of a futon, a folding table, 2 plastic chairs, and a TV he'd found on the curb 3 years ago. The walls were bare except for a calendar from the local hardware store, and a photograph he kept meaning to take down but never did. The photograph showed Marcus at 26, standing on a competition podium with a gold medal around his neck, flanked by the silver and bronze medalists. His hair was longer then, styled in short locks, his face younger and unmarked by the years of manual labor that would follow. He was smiling in the photograph, genuinely smiling, the expression of someone who believed the future held nothing but opportunity and success. Marcus looked at that photograph for a long moment, then turned away and opened his refrigerator. Leftover rice and beans from 2 days ago, a half-empty carton of orange juice, some wilting vegetables he'd bought on sale. He heated up the rice and beans in his microwave, ate standing at the counter, and washed his single plate and fork in the sink. His phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. He considered ignoring it, then opened it. "This is Professor Silva. Got your number from the employee records. Hope that's okay. Just wanted to say again that we'd love to have you as part of the team. No pressure. But I think you have a lot to offer, and it would be a shame to let that go to waste. Think about it." Marcus typed a response. "Thank you. I appreciate the offer." He hesitated, then added, "I'll let you know soon." He set the phone down and moved to the single window in his apartment. It overlooked the parking lot and, beyond that, a convenience store with flickering neon signs. Not a beautiful view, but it was his view, part of the life he'd built from nothing after everything had collapsed. A stable life, a predictable life, a safe life. But safety came at a cost. He'd learned that over the past 11 years. Safety meant isolation. It meant not taking risks that might lead to disappointment. It meant keeping parts of yourself locked away, because exposing them made you vulnerable to judgment and loss and the kind of pain that came from caring about something too much. Tonight had reminded him of what that locked-away part of himself felt like. The precision of movement, the intellectual chess game of grappling with a skilled opponent, the satisfaction of executing techniques so cleanly that it felt like art rather than combat. He'd forgotten how much he'd loved that. Or maybe he'd just convinced himself he'd forgotten because remembering was too painful. His phone buzzed again, different number this time. The message contained a link to a YouTube video. "Dude, you have to see this. Someone posted footage of that janitor who destroyed Ethan tonight. It's going viral." Marcus clicked the link. The video had been recorded by one of the students on their phone, the angle showing Marcus and Ethan's second roll from start to finish. The caption read, "BJJ black belt gets absolutely demolished by mysterious janitor, former world champion revealed." The video had been posted 40 minutes ago and already had 12,000 views and climbing. The comments section was exploding with reactions. "That's Marcus Washington, holy shit, I remember him. Where has this guy been? He was supposed to be the next big thing. That lateral drop into side control was clean. Bro moved like it was 2014 again. Someone get this man back on the competition circuit." Marcus closed the video and set his phone face down on the counter. The exposure he'd worried about was already happening, faster than he'd anticipated, spreading through the jiu-jitsu community with the viral velocity that characterized everything in the modern internet age. By tomorrow morning, everyone in the sport would know that Marcus Washington was working as a janitor at a local academy. By tomorrow afternoon, the questions would begin in earnest. He could ignore it all, delete the messages, turn off his phone, go to work tomorrow night and the night after that, and continue living the quiet life he'd constructed. Eventually, the attention would fade. People would move on to the next viral moment, the next surprising story, the next dramatic upset. He could return to invisibility, or he could do something different. Marcus pulled out his laptop, an old machine that took 2 minutes to boot up. He opened his email and composed a new message to Professor Silva. "I've been thinking about your offer. I'd like to accept. When can we discuss the details? He hit send before he could reconsider, then closed the laptop and stared at the blank screen. His heart was racing again, but this time it wasn't from adrenaline. It was from the recognition that he'd just made a decision that would change everything, that would pull him back into a world he'd spent years trying to leave behind, that would force him to confront questions about where he'd been and why he'd disappeared and whether he had anything left to prove. But maybe that confrontation was long overdue. Maybe spending 11 years in hiding had been its own form of defeat, a slower and more insidious kind of loss than the knee injury that had ended his competitive career. Maybe the real injury hadn't been to his ligaments and cartilage, but to his willingness to risk failure and disappointment in pursuit of something meaningful. Marcus returned to the window. The convenience store's neon signs continued their irregular flickering, casting pools of colored light across the parking lot. A car pulled in, someone getting a late-night snack or cigarettes or lottery tickets. Ordinary life continuing its ordinary patterns. But Marcus felt different now, as if some internal decision had shifted the trajectory of his existence by a few degrees, a small change in angle that would compound over time into a completely different destination. His phone buzzed continuously over the next hour, messages from people he'd trained with years ago, fellow competitors who'd heard about the video and wanted to reconnect. An email from a journalist who wrote for a major martial arts publication asking for an interview about his disappearance and reappearance. A text from someone claiming to be a manager who wanted to discuss sponsorship opportunities if Marcus was planning a comeback. He ignored most of them. The attention felt overwhelming, intrusive, like having strangers peer through windows into rooms he'd kept locked. But he did respond to one message from a former training partner named Devin, who'd competed alongside him during their brown belt years. "Bro, I can't believe that was you. Where have you been? We all thought you died or something. You just vanished after Sao Paulo. Nobody knew what happened." Marcus typed slowly, trying to find words that explained without oversharing. Got injured, couldn't compete, had to figure out a different life. Took a while. Devin's response came quickly. "Man, I'm sorry. That must have been rough. But you looked good in that video. Real good. You thinking about coming back? Maybe, taking it slow. If you do, let me know. We should train together again, catch up on old times." Marcus sent a thumbs-up emoji and set his phone aside. Old times? The phrase carried weight, implied nostalgia for a period of life that had been simultaneously the best and most intense years of his existence. Training twice a day, 6 days a week, his entire identity wrapped up in his competition performance. Living in cramped apartments with other fighters, surviving on rice and protein powder and whatever free food they could find. Flying to tournaments in Brazil, Japan, Abu Dhabi, the constant travel and jet lag and weight cutting that came with the professional competition circuit. The injuries that accumulated like tax on ambition, broken fingers that never healed straight, constant mat burn on his elbows and feet, the chronic neck pain from thousands of hours spent in resistance against choking pressure, but also the moments of pure excellence, the perfect execution of a technique he'd drilled 10,000 times, delivered in a world championship final against an opponent everyone said he couldn't beat. The respect of his peers, the recognition from legendary figures in the sport, the sense of being part of something larger than himself, the belief that he was building towards something significant, that his suffering had purpose, that the sacrifice would be worth it. Then the injury and the abrupt end to all of that. Marcus had never properly processed that loss. He'd been too focused on survival, on figuring out how to pay rent and eat and rebuild his knee well enough to function in normal life. Grief was a luxury he couldn't afford when he was struggling to make minimum wage at a job that required him to stand for 8-hour shifts. So he'd compartmentalized it, locked it away, pretended the past 11 years had been a reasonable and acceptable outcome rather than a tragedy he'd never fully acknowledged. Tonight had broken open that compartment. He slept poorly, waking multiple times to check his phone and find new messages, new comments on the video, new articles being written about the mysterious return of Marcus Washington. By morning, the video had 500,000 views. A major grappling promotion had shared it on their Instagram account. Retired champions were commenting. offering their analysis of his technique and speculating about whether he still had what it took to compete at a high level. Marcus dragged himself out of bed at noon, made instant coffee in his single mug, and checked his email. Professor Silva had responded overnight, his message enthusiastic and detailed. They could meet this afternoon to discuss the instructor position, work out a schedule, talk about compensation. The email's tone suggested Silva saw this as more than just hiring an assistant instructor. He saw it as an opportunity to bring someone special into his academy, to add legitimacy and expertise that would benefit all his students. Marcus showered in his cramped bathroom, the water pressure weak but sufficient. He shaved for the first time in a week, trimmed his hair as best he could with the clippers he'd bought at a pharmacy, and put on clothes that were clean, if not fashionable. Looking in the mirror, he saw someone caught between identities. Not quite the champion he'd been at 28, not quite the invisible janitor he'd been yesterday morning, something in between that hadn't yet defined itself. The meeting with Silva was scheduled for 3 o'clock. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, parking in the same spot where his car had sat the night before. The academy looked different in daylight, less dramatic, more utilitarian. Just a converted warehouse space with mats and mirrors and equipment, the mundane infrastructure that supported the art they practiced inside. Silva greeted him warmly, shaking his hand and gesturing toward his office. The space was cramped, filled with filing cabinets and stacks of paperwork and photographs of Silva with various Brazilian jiu-jitsu legends. They sat across from each other at a desk cluttered with competition medals being used as paperweights. "I've been thinking about this all night," Silva said. "Having you here could be transformative for our academy, not just because of your technique, but because of what you represent. You've been to the top. You've competed against the best in the world. That experience is invaluable for students who are serious about improving." Marcus nodded, letting Silva continue. "I want to offer you a position teaching our intermediate and advanced classes, 3 evenings a week, 2 hours per session. The pay would be $40 per hour, plus the free membership I mentioned. That's in addition to your custodial work if you want to keep doing that, though honestly I'd rather have you focused on teaching." $40 an hour for 6 hours a week meant $240 weekly, almost $1,000 a month. Combined with his other part-time job at the warehouse, that would be enough to live on comfortably, maybe even save a little. And the free membership meant he could train during open mat times, rebuild his conditioning, remember what his body was capable of when pushed. "I accept," Marcus said. Silva's face broke into a genuine smile. "Excellent. We can start next week. That gives you time to prepare. Think about what you want to teach. I'd also like to have you do a seminar next month, open to students from other academies too. We can charge admission, split the proceeds. Good way to build your profile again, let people know you're back." Back. The word implied a return to something, a resumption of an interrupted trajectory. Marcus wasn't sure if that's what this was. He felt more like he was starting something new that happened to incorporate elements of his old life, rather than genuinely returning to who he'd been before. But he didn't correct Silva's language. Let. People interpret it however they needed to. They spent the next hour discussing curriculum, philosophy, teaching methodology. Silva was old school in some ways, emphasizing fundamental positions and classical techniques over the sport-specific innovations that had emerged in recent years. But he was also pragmatic, recognizing that modern jiu-jitsu had evolved, and that effective teaching required understanding both the traditional foundations and contemporary developments. Marcus found himself enjoying the conversation, contributing ideas about how to structure classes for maximum learning, how to balance drilling with live training, how to help students understand the conceptual frameworks that connected individual techniques into coherent systems. Teaching had never been his primary focus during his competitive years, but he'd spent countless hours helping training partners understand details and adjustments, and that experience translated into pedagogical intuitions he hadn't realized he possessed. By the time the meeting ended, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not quite excitement, but something adjacent to it. Anticipation, maybe? The sense that the immediate future held possibility rather than just the grinding repetition of survival. He left the academy and drove to his warehouse job, arriving just as his shift began at 5 p.m. The work was purely physical, unloading trucks, sorting packages, stacking boxes on pallets. mindless labor that paid $13 an hour and required nothing of him except his body. His coworkers were friendly in a distant way, people who clocked in and out and didn't ask personal questions. Tonight, though, one of them approached him during their break, holding up his phone. "Yo, Marcus, is this you?" The screen showed the viral video, now with over 1 million views. Marcus's face was clearly visible, his movements captured in detail. There was no denying it was him. "Yeah," Marcus said, "that's me." His coworker's expression transformed from curiosity to something approaching awe. "Bro, you're famous. This video is everywhere. People are going crazy trying to figure out who you are and where you've been. You really just work here moving boxes?" "Not just. I have other jobs too." The deflection sounded weak even to Marcus's ears. "Man, if I could fight like that, I'd be doing it full time. Making money, getting sponsors, living the life. Why you working warehouse shifts?" Because life didn't work the way people imagined it did. Because one injury could derail everything. Because professional fighting required financial backing and time and luck, and sometimes you ran out of all three simultaneously. Because rebuilding from nothing took years, and during those years, you had to survive somehow, and survival meant taking whatever work you could find. But Marcus didn't say any of that. He just shrugged. Things change, gotta adapt. His coworker shook his head, still staring at the video. "Wild. This is wild, man." He walked away, and Marcus could hear him showing the video to other workers, their voices rising with excitement and disbelief. The rest of the shift passed slowly. Marcus focused on the work, letting the physical labor create a buffer between himself and the growing awareness that his life had fundamentally changed in the past 24 hours. When he finally clocked out at midnight, his body ached in the familiar way that came from hours of repetitive heavy lifting. A different kind of exhaustion than the sharp burn of athletic training. He drove home through empty streets, noticing details he usually missed. The way streetlights created pools of illumination in the darkness. The occasional car passing in the opposite direction. Other night workers heading home, or early shift workers heading to their jobs. The city felt different at this hour. Quieter, more honest somehow. Stripped of the daytime pretenses and reduced to its essential functions. His phone showed 37 new messages and 42 new emails. Marcus scrolled through them quickly, categorizing without reading carefully. Journalists wanting interviews, former training partners reconnecting. Random people from the jiu-jitsu community offering congratulations or asking questions. A few messages that seemed vaguely threatening, suggesting he was a fraud or criticizing him for abandoning the sport. He deleted those without responding. One email stood out. The sender was Master Cavalcanti, the legendary Brazilian instructor who had promoted Marcus to black belt 14 years ago. Marcus hadn't spoken to him since the injury, too ashamed to explain what had happened, too proud to ask for help when he'd needed it most. The email was brief. "Marcus, I saw the video of you training. I am glad you are well. I have thought of you often over the years and hoped you were happy. If you wish to speak, I would enjoy hearing from you. You were one of my best students, and I have always regretted losing contact. With respect and friendship, Cavalcanti." Marcus read the email 3 times, emotion building in his chest with each reading. Cavalcanti had been more than just an instructor. He had been a mentor, a father figure during the years when Marcus had been living in Brazil and training full-time. Cavalcanti had provided guidance not just about technique, but about life, about how to handle success with humility, about the importance of character over medals. Walking away from that relationship had been one of the unspoken costs of Marcus's disappearance, a loss he'd tried not to think about because thinking about it hurt too much. He composed a response, deleting and rewriting it several times before settling on something simple. "Master Cavalcanti, it is good to hear from you. I apologize for disappearing. Life became complicated after my injury, and I wasn't sure how to explain what had happened. I would very much like to speak with you when you have time. With gratitude and respect, Marcus." He sent the email before he could reconsider it, then set his phone aside and lay down on his futon. Sleep came eventually, though not easily, his mind cycling through memories and possibilities and anxieties about the future he'd just committed to pursuing. The next few days passed in a blur of continued attention and practical preparation. The video's view count climbed past 3 million. Multiple martial arts media outlets published articles about Marcus's story, though most were speculative since he hadn't given any interviews. Professor Silva fielded dozens of inquiries from students at other academies who wanted to train at the academy specifically because Marcus would be teaching there. Marcus spent his free time at the academy, reacclimating his body to the demands of training. His knee held up better than he'd expected. The years of careful rehabilitation and modified movement patterns had built a kind of stability that, while different from his pre-injury athleticism, was sufficient for most techniques. He wouldn't be able to pull off the explosive dynamic movements that had characterized his competitive prime, but he could still execute fundamental jiu-jitsu at a high level. He rolled with various students during open mat sessions, carefully moderating his intensity to match his partners. With lower belts, he focused on teaching, allowing them to work their techniques while offering gentle corrections and alternative options. With upper belts, he gradually increased his engagement, testing his timing and reaction speed, rediscovering the chess game quality of high-level grappling. The purple belt woman from the first night, her name was Sarah, became something of a regular training partner. She was technically sound, asked intelligent questions, and didn't treat him like a curiosity. During one of their sessions, while they were resting between rounds, she brought up what everyone was thinking, but most were too polite to ask directly. "What happened to your knee? Everyone knows you had an injury, but nobody knows the details." Marcus considered deflecting, but Sarah had earned a straight answer through her respectful approach. "Tore my ACL, meniscus, and damaged the articular cartilage during a tournament in Brazil. The guy was losing badly and went for a heel hook that was borderline illegal. My knee hyperextended before I could tap. By the time I got back to the States and saw a doctor, the damage was worse than it needed to be." "That's horrible. I'm sorry." "It happens. Combat sports are dangerous. We all know the risks when we sign up." "But it ended your career. You were supposed to be world champion at black belt. Everyone said so." Marcus shrugged. "Everyone says a lot of things. Most of them don't come true." Sarah studied him for a moment. "You seem really philosophical about it. I think I'd be angry." "I was angry, for years. But anger doesn't heal ligaments or pay bills. Eventually, you have to accept what is and figure out how to move forward." "Is that what teaching is for you? Moving forward?" The question was more perceptive than Marcus had expected. He thought about it carefully before answering. "I think so. It's a way to stay connected to something I love without destroying myself trying to recapture what I used to have. The competitive career is gone, but the knowledge is still there. Maybe passing it on matters more than I thought it did." They resumed rolling, and Marcus didn't bring up the subject again, but the conversation stuck with him, forcing him to articulate what this new chapter might mean. He'd spent 11 years treating his past as something to escape from, a source of pain and regret that was better left unexamined. But maybe there was another way to relate to it, not as a loss to be mourned, but as a foundation to build on differently. Master Cavalcanti responded to Marcus's email with a phone number and a suggestion to call when convenient. Marcus procrastinated for 2 days, anxiety building each time he looked at the number, before finally forcing himself to dial it one evening after finishing his warehouse shift. Cavalcanti answered on the third ring. His voice was exactly as Marcus remembered it, warm and textured with a Brazilian accent that decades in America hadn't erased. "Marcus, it is good to hear from you. I am happy you reached out." They talked for over an hour. Marcus explained what had happened after the injury, the financial struggles, the inability to afford proper treatment, the years spent rebuilding himself physically and economically from zero. Cavalcanti listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting Marcus speak. It felt therapeutic to finally tell someone the whole story, to acknowledge the difficulty of those years without pretending they'd been easier than they were. "I thought about reaching out to you for help," Marcus admitted, "but I was ashamed. You'd invested so much time in my training, believed in me when other instructors didn't, promoted me to black belt, and I just disappeared. Couldn't even make it to one world championship at black belt before everything fell apart. I felt like I'd let you down." "Marcus, you did not let me down." Cavalcanti's tone was firm. "Life happens. Injuries happen. You think you are the first talented fighter to have his career ended by injury? You are not. What matters is character, how you handle difficulty. From what I hear, you kept training yourself back to health. You worked hard jobs to survive. You did not give up on life, even though your dreams changed. That shows strong character. I am proud of you." The words hit harder than Marcus expected. He felt his throat tighten with emotion he'd been suppressing for years. "I am teaching now," Marcus said, changing the subject before the emotion overwhelmed him. "Professor Silva at the academy where I was working gave me a position as an instructor. That is wonderful. You will be a good teacher. You always understood jiu-jitsu conceptually, not just technically. The best teachers are the ones who can explain the why behind the how." They talked about teaching philosophy, about the evolution of jiu-jitsu over the past decade, about various mutual acquaintances from Marcus's competitive years. Cavalcanti mentioned that he was planning to visit the United States in a few months for a seminar tour and suggested they meet in person if Marcus was available. "I would like that very much," Marcus said. After hanging up, he sat in his car in the warehouse parking lot for a long time, processing the conversation. Reconnecting with Cavalcanti felt like retrieving a piece of himself that had been lost. A reminder that his identity wasn't just defined by his failures, but also by the relationships and experiences that had shaped him before everything collapsed. His first day teaching arrived the following Tuesday. The intermediate class had 15 students, ranging from blue belts to brown belts, people who'd been training long enough to understand fundamental concepts, but were still developing their individual games. Marcus had spent hours preparing, reviewing technique progressions, thinking about how to structure the 2-hour session for maximum learning value. He introduced himself briefly, acknowledging that some of them probably knew who he was from the viral video, but emphasizing that his competitive past was less relevant than the work they would do together in class. Then he launched into the technical content, focusing on a connected series of guard passing techniques that shared common principles of base, pressure, and weight distribution. Teaching felt natural in a way that surprised him, breaking down complex movements into digestible steps, explaining the mechanical reasons why certain grips worked better than others, demonstrating common mistakes and how to correct them. All of it came fluidly once he stopped overthinking and just let his knowledge express itself. The students were attentive and engaged, asking good questions, drilling with focus. During the live training portion at the end of class, Marcus rolled with several students, calibrating his intensity to challenge them without overwhelming them. With a blue belt who was struggling with closed guard retention, Marcus stayed in guard and coached him through different retention strategies while the round was happening, turning the sparring session into a real-time tutorial. With a brown belt who had solid fundamentals but limited competition experience, Marcus gradually increased the pressure and pace, simulating the kind of intense exchanges she'd face in tournaments. After class ended, several students approached to thank him and ask additional questions. Professor Silva, who'd been watching from the side, gave him a thumbs up and a nod of approval. Walking back to his car later, Marcus felt something he recognized from his competitive years, the satisfaction of doing something difficult well, the sense of competence that came from applying expertise effectively. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm to his life. He taught 3 evenings per week at the academy, trained during open mat sessions when his warehouse shift allowed, maintained his custodial work 2 nights weekly for additional income, and gradually built relationships with students who were genuinely interested in learning rather than just training with someone whose video had gone viral. The attention from the broader jiu-jitsu community didn't disappear, but it did fade somewhat from its initial intensity. There would always be curiosity about where Marcus had been and what had happened, but as more time passed without him seeking publicity or trying to capitalize on his moment of viral fame, people started accepting him simply as a good instructor at a local academy rather than some kind of phenomenon to be analyzed. Ethan, the black belt who'd initiated the initial confrontation, became one of Marcus's most dedicated students. He showed up to every class Marcus taught, took notes on his phone, asked thoughtful questions about details and adjustments. One evening after class, he apologized again, more thoroughly this time. "I've been thinking about that night a lot," Ethan said, "about why I did that, called you out like that. I think I was frustrated with my own training, feeling like I'd plateaued, and taking it out on someone I saw as beneath me. That's fucked up. I'm sorry." "You learned something from it," Marcus said. "That's what matters. I learned I'm not as good as I thought I was. And I learned that you can't judge someone by their job or their appearance. You never know what someone's capable of until you actually engage with them respectfully. Marcus nodded. Those are good lessons, more important than technique, honestly. Ethan smiled. Can I ask you something? Do you ever think about competing again? Because watching you move, I think you could still do it. Maybe not at the very highest level, but there are masters divisions, local tournaments. You could easily win matches. Marcus had been asking himself the same question. His knee felt stable during training. His timing and technical understanding were as sharp as ever. The idea of competing again held a certain appeal, a way to prove to himself that the past 11 years hadn't completely erased what he'd built before. I don't know, he said honestly. Part of me wants to. Part of me thinks that chapter is closed and I should focus on teaching. Well, if you ever decide to compete, let me know. I'll be in your corner. The offer was genuine, and Marcus appreciated it. He'd been alone for so long that the idea of having people in his corner again felt both appealing and slightly terrifying. Support created obligation. It meant people were invested in his success or failure. It meant disappointing others if things went wrong. But maybe that was part of living fully rather than just surviving. Accepting that connection involved risk, that meaningful relationships required vulnerability. The seminar Silva had mentioned took place in early December. 25 students attended, mix of people from the academy and visitors from other schools in the region. Marcus taught for 3 hours, covering his approach to pressure passing against different guard styles, the conceptual frameworks that made techniques work together as systems rather than isolated moves, and live troubleshooting, where students could ask about specific problems they encountered in their games. The seminar was received enthusiastically. Students lined up afterward to shake his hand, take photos, ask follow-up questions. A few asked him to sign their GIs, which felt strange but also touched something in Marcus, the recognition that his knowledge and experience had value to others, that the years of suffering and sacrifice hadn't been entirely wasted even if his competitive career had ended prematurely. Silva split the seminar proceeds with Marcus as promised, handing him an envelope with $400 in cash. It was the most money Marcus had received at once in years. He stared at the envelope for a moment, processing the fact that he'd just been paid for sharing knowledge rather than for manual labor, that his expertise had quantifiable economic value in a way his warehouse work never could. You did great, Silva said. People are already asking when the next one will be. I'm thinking we could do these quarterly. Maybe invite students from farther away, make it a bigger event. Marcus slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket. I'd be interested in that. You know what else we should think about? Silva's eyes gleamed with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he'd been planning this pitch. Getting you back to competition, Masters Division. There's a big tournament coming up in March. I think you could win your weight class easily. Good for you, good for the Academy's reputation, good for attracting students. There it was. The question that had been circling around Marcus's consciousness for weeks now, presented directly. My knee, Marcus began. Your knee is fine. I've watched you roll with brown and black belts. You're moving well. Not like a 25-year-old, sure, but none of us are 25 anymore. You're still better than 99% of the people who would enter that tournament. Marcus thought about it. The fear of re-injury was real, but it was also partially a rationalization for deeper anxieties about failure, about trying and losing, about publicly demonstrating that he wasn't who he used to be. He'd hidden behind the injury narrative for years, using it as an excuse not to risk disappointment, but Silva was right. His knee was stable. The real obstacle was psychological. Let me think about it, Marcus said. Don't think too long. Registration closes end of January. Marcus drove home that night with Silva's words echoing in his mind. A tournament in March, 12 weeks to prepare. It wouldn't be the World Championships or even a major regional competition, just a local masters tournament where the level of competition would be respectable but not elite. A reasonable first step if he wanted to test himself again. A manageable risk. But risk nonetheless. What if he lost in the first round? What if his knee failed under the pressure of actual competition? What if everyone who'd gotten excited about his return realized he was just a washed-up former competitor trying to recapture past glory? The potential for humiliation felt immense. Yet there was also the other possibility. What if he competed and won? What if he proved to himself that the past 11 years hadn't destroyed everything he'd built? that his skills and knowledge translated beyond teaching, that he was still capable of performing under pressure? What if winning helped him finally move beyond the identity of someone whose career had been tragically cut short and into the identity of someone who had rebuilt himself successfully? The following week, Marcus increased his training intensity. He started rolling harder during open mat sessions, specifically seeking out the academy's toughest competitors. He worked extra drilling sessions with students who were preparing for tournaments themselves, using their competitive focus to sharpen his own timing. He paid attention to his body's response to increased workload, monitoring his knee for signs of instability or pain that would indicate he was pushing too hard. His knee held up. The conditioning came back more quickly than he expected, his cardiovascular system remembering what high-intensity interval work felt like even after years of more moderate activity. The rust in his game was there. Certain reactions were slower than they used to be. Certain positions felt less secure than they had during his prime. But the foundation remained solid. During a roll with the brown belt named Trevor, Marcus found himself in a position he would have easily escaped during his competitive years, but now required genuine problem-solving to navigate. Trevor had secured a tight knee slice pass and was methodically working to flatten Marcus's guard, his pressure heavy and his base solid. For 30 seconds, Marcus was stuck, unable to create the frames and angles he needed to recover guard or escape to his feet. Then muscle memory kicked in, a small detail about hip angle that Cavalcanti had taught him years ago, an adjustment to his bottom arm position that created a fraction more space, a timed explosion that caught Trevor mid-breath and allowed Marcus to insert his knee shield and recover half guard. From there, Marcus swept Trevor with a technique he'd hit hundreds of times in competition, the timing perfect, the execution clean. Trevor tapped hands, afterward, grinning. "Damn, you made that look easy." "It wasn't," Marcus admitted. "You had me in trouble for a minute there, but I remembered something my old instructor taught me. Sometimes the smallest details make the biggest difference." "That's what I love about jiu-jitsu," Trevor said. "You can always learn something new, find some tiny adjustment that changes everything." The conversation stayed with Marcus. He'd forgotten that aspect of the sport, the endless depth, the way a lifetime of study still left countless problems to solve and techniques to refine. Competition had focused him on winning, on performing under pressure, on accumulating victories that would advance his career. But the deeper pleasure of jiu-jitsu came from the learning itself, from the intellectual and physical puzzle solving that continued regardless of whether there was a medal on the line. Maybe that realization made the decision easier. The next evening, Marcus approached Silva before class started. "I'll do the tournament in March. Register me for Masters 1 middleweight division." Silva's face broke into a massive smile. "Yes, this is excellent, Marcus. We'll get you ready. Whatever you need, extra training partners, technique work, competition simulation, we'll make it happen." "I don't want to make a big deal about it," Marcus said. "No social media announcements, no press releases. If I'm going to do this, I want to do it quietly. Prove something to myself first before worrying about what anyone else thinks." Silva nodded, understanding. "Just us, then. Between you and me, and the students who train with you. We keep it low-key until after the tournament." They shook hands, formalizing the commitment. Marcus taught his class that evening with a different kind of energy, knowing that he was now on a timeline, that every training session from this point forward had specific purpose beyond general improvement. He was preparing for competition again. After 11 years, he was going to step onto the mat as a competitor rather than a teacher or a training partner or a janitor who could move surprisingly well. The thought terrified him. But it also felt right, like he was finally closing a circle that had been left open for too long, like he was giving himself permission to want something beyond mere survival. The injury had taken his career, but maybe it hadn't taken everything. Maybe there was still something to prove, still something to achieve, still a way to transform loss into a different kind of victory. That night, lying on his futon in his small apartment, Marcus allowed himself to imagine winning the tournament, standing on the podium again after all these years, proving that the viral video hadn't been a fluke or an accident, but a legitimate demonstration of preserved skills, showing the students who'd watched him dominate Ethan that he was more than just a former competitor who could still handle himself in a casual role. He was someone who could compete and win But he also imagined losing, tapping to a younger, faster opponent who simply overwhelmed him, his knee failing mid-match, forcing him to forfeit, walking off the mat in defeat, confirming everyone's assumption that his best years were permanently behind him. The imagined humiliation felt vivid and painful. Both futures were possible. Both might happen. The uncertainty was part of what made the decision meaningful. If victory were guaranteed, it wouldn't prove anything. If defeat were certain, there'd be no point in trying. But in the space between those poles, in the unknown territory where effort and skill met chance and circumstance, that's where real growth occurred. That's where you discovered what you were actually made of. Marcus closed his eyes and let sleep come, knowing that whatever happened in March, he'd made the right choice by saying yes. Not because he would necessarily win, but because he'd stopped letting fear make his decisions for him. After 11 years of playing it safe, of choosing invisibility over risk, of treating himself as broken rather than simply wounded, he was finally ready to be visible again. The whispers would continue spreading through the jiu-jitsu community. Stories about the Janitor, who moved like a world champion. Speculation about whether Marcus Washington was really back or just making a brief cameo before disappearing again. Questions about whether his skills were genuine or inflated by the dramatic circumstances of the viral video. Let them whisper. Let them speculate. Let them question. Marcus would answer them the only way that mattered, on the mat, with his performance, with the same technical precision and heart that had defined him before the injury, and that, despite everything, still defined him now. He was more than just a janitor. He was more than just a viral video. He was Marcus Washington, black belt under Master Cavalcanti, former Pan Am champion, former World Championship competitor, current instructor, and soon-to-be tournament competitor again. All of those identities were true simultaneously. All of them mattered. And in 12 weeks, when he stepped onto the competition mat for the first time in 11 years, everyone would see exactly what that meant. The light in his apartment finally turned off, leaving only the glow from the streetlights outside. But Marcus was already dreaming of competition, of movement, of the moment when his hand would be raised in victory and he would know, finally and completely, that he had truly come back from the place where defeat had left him all those years ago.